Welcome back. White House officials say there will be a summit between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. As Kylie Atwood reports, we don't know when or where the summit will take place, but we do have a sense of what's on the agenda.
Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, sat across the table from Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow today to hammer out the details for a highly anticipated Putin-Trump summit.
Both President Trump and President Putin feel that it's important for these two leaders of these two critically important countries to get together and discuss their mutual problems and areas of cooperation.
Bolton pushed back on criticism of the meeting.
Both President Trump and President Putin think they may be able to find constructive solutions. I'd like to hear someone say that's a bad idea.
Putin cast Bolton's visit as launching a revival to the ever-degrading U.S.-Russia relations. According to the Washington Post, Putin said Russia has never sought confrontation. Trump has repeatedly said that it would be good for the Cold War foes to have warmer relations.
Just like North Korea, just like somebody else, it's much better if we get along with them than if we don't.
Bolton also referenced other countries when he defended Trump's decision to sit down with Putin.
The leaders of the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Greece, Finland, Austria, Belgium, and Italy have all had bilateral meetings with President Putin. So just taking Europe as an example, many leaders of Europe have met with President Putin.
Yet there is a deep river of bad blood between the U.S. and Russia. Russia maintains that it did not interfere in the 2016 presidential election, despite U.S. evidence. Russia aggression in Ukraine and Syria continues, and the Kremlin carried out strikes in southwest Syria as recently as today. The Mueller investigation is also continuing, looking into the collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign in the 2016 presidential election. Washington and Moscow are set to announce the details of this summit tomorrow, but a Putin aide said it would include a working breakfast and a press conference. I also want to point out that National Security Advisor John Bolton is an unlikely enabler of this meeting. Just last year, he wrote that U.S. and Russia negotiating would be at the peril of the U.S. Elaine?
Kylie, thank you. Joining me now to discuss the possible Trump-Putin summit is Gabe Lipton. Gabe is a CBSN contributor and a writer for G0 Media's Signal newsletter. Gabe, thanks so much for stopping by. What is the president hoping to accomplish with this summit with Vladimir Putin?
So we know that President Trump loves the optics of symmetry. We saw that in his meeting with President Xi of China, in his meeting with the leader of North Korea, and I think in this meeting with Putin, he's going to a country where he's widely popular, and he's trying to broker some solutions to major issues. But I think this is a summit that is actually probably the most challenging of all for President Trump, because the what he's aiming to accomplish is pretty unclear. The U.S. and Russia have had for many presidents have had very contentious relations. And previous presidents, whether Obama or Bush, have struggled to sort of forge throughout their entire tenure a strong relationship. So this is really a challenge for Trump. On the one hand, he goes to a country where he's very popular, but at home he has a domestic populace that is generally very skeptical of Russia. Obviously, the Mueller indictment is sort of in the background on all of this. So he has to go and, on the one hand, sort of work with Putin, but on the other, not look like he is placating Russia.
So what about Vladimir Putin? I mean, what does he get out of a summit with President Trump?
I mean, it's also tricky for Vladimir Putin. On the one hand, he has his domestic audience, where he was just recently reelected with in a sort of a contentious sort of election that foreign observers, was certainly not free and fair. And he also has a foreign audience in the U.S. He doesn't want particularly members of Congress to pile on sanctions. He wants sanctions relief. He certainly is going to want to work on issues in Syria and in Ukraine, on security issues. So he's also trying to balance his desire to sort of assert Russia's state sort of position at the global table. He can meet with the U.S. president, but also not to seem like he's pulling the strings behind the scene as Congress ramps up pressure on Russia.
Given that complicated landscape, What do you think the chances are that Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election is actually going to come up?
I think it's pretty unlikely, actually. I mean, I could see the U.S. president bringing it up, but he has clearly come out and said that he contests the sort of even the context that they meddled. He eventually said that he accepted that fact, but he doesn't want to push Russia on that issue. To be fair to the U.S. president, the administration has pushed sanctions against Russia, but I could see, for example, lower-level officials bringing up issues around the upcoming midterms where there is a continued fear that Russia could be involved.
Let me ask you, I mean, you mentioned other administrations. Isn't this attempt to reach out to Vladimir Putin essentially what we've seen before from other administrations, where at the beginning there's an attempt to reach out to Vladimir Putin and connect with him and say, you know, we've established this rapport. I remember President Bush saying famously that he saw into his soul,
exactly.
Right? There was a reset under the Obama administration, right, with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at that time. Isn't this really sort of the pattern that American presidents have followed, where at the beginning, at the outset, they try and get essentially some kind of rapport established and use that perhaps, if they can, to deal with other issues?
Yeah, in dealing with Russia, every single U.S. president faces a basic question. What should be the grounds for a constructive relationship? Arms control has traditionally played that role, and we saw with the Obama administration substantive progress on the issue of nuclear arms reduction and cooperation. But as you mentioned, there usually is a major hurdle. For the President Obama, that was the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. For President Bush, it was Russia's conflict with Georgia. So, like you mentioned, there's usually certain areas where the two countries can cooperate, but then a crisis usually emerges that brings the two to loggerheads. And the president, with all the backdrop of the Mueller investigation, with all of the questions of Russian meddling in the U.S. elections, has an extra sort of set of issues that already complicate this traditional relationship that has been very tough.
And in addition, you have Syria, where the United States is still involved in the situation, which, you know, many look at as this proxy war taking place. That is a war that has continued. How could that ongoing situation somehow affect what we're going to see here with the Putin-Trump summit?
The main areas where the U.S. and Russia currently cooperate in Syria are in so-called deconflicting zones in the southwest of the country, where they basically work to make sure their soldiers don't come and clash together and prevent sort of casualties in that area. But broadly speaking, I think what the U.S. is interested in is in the post-conflict solution. It wants to work with Russia to make sure that once the conflict is over and the Assad regime sort of retakes control of the entire country, that it has some say in what that resolution looks like. It is also worried about continued Iranian influence in the country. So I suspect that President Trump and his advisors will bring up the issue of whether Russia can do some things to prevent Iranian influence, the influence of Iranian militias in the country. But I think the Russians don't want to give too much to the U.S. on that front.
So far under the Trump administration, we have seen this geopolitical shift, I think is fair to say, where these scenes are taking place that in the past, maybe just a few years ago, you never could imagine an American president shaking hands with a North Korean leader. You could not imagine an American president going after G7 allies in a very public and forceful way. How are other countries viewing this notion of a Trump-Putin summit?
Very warily. And we have to understand the context of this meeting will come after a NATO summit in early July, where President Trump will be attending, a summit where he has sort of cast a lot of questions about the U.S.'s continued commitment to NATO. So I think U.S. allies, especially in Europe, are looking at this meeting, looking at President Trump's commitment to the NATO alliance, which has traditionally sort of been a bedrock of American foreign policy, and wondering whether he will give on major areas there. So they are very wary. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that Europe in particular views U.S. sanctions on Russia also as problematic. They traditionally hurt European companies that cooperate a lot with Russian companies. So on the economic side, I think there is some notion that you could work together to tamp down the relationship. But on the security side, there's sort of a broader reluctance or wariness about U.S. president's commitment to NATO.
Do we know about Ukraine? How does the Ukrainian government feel about this?
Ukraine is a more difficult question, and the main area where the U.S. is working with Ukraine is and Russia is the so-called Minsk peace process that was instituted after the 2014 conflict, and where they're working to sort of come to a cohesive agreement to sort of stop fighting in the east of the country. I think that President Trump will probably bring up some breaches of that agreement, but the main thing is sort of the need for the Ukrainian government to institute parts of that agreement, and that's the main hurdle there. So I think that they're probably happy that he's meeting with President Putin, hoping that he continues support and in supplying arms to the Ukraine as they fight this proxy conflict with Russia, but also understanding that they have to get their own ducks in a row if there is going to be a broader peace in the country.
Right, a lot to watch. Gabe Lipton of G0 Media. Gabe, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.